Tonight's lecture will go through sleep and metabolic health, and hopefully by the end of it I would have made a case about how important sleep is for general health, but more precisely for metabolic health. This is the content of the presentation today. I'll start with an introduction about me. I'll go then through metabolic health and sleep in terms of what they are, some basic definitions, and how I define them myself for the research that I'm going to present. I'm then going to talk about the reciprocal relationship between metabolic health and sleep, how sleep affects metabolic health and vice versa. And I'm going to conclude with a summary of the findings from the research evidence that I'm going to present. We can then address any questions that you may have about it at the end of the presentation, if that's okay. Okay, so we'll start with about me. I am Iuliana Hartescu. I am a lecturer in psychology at Loughborough University in the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences. My research concerns sleep behavior and health outcomes. I look both of how daytime lifestyle behaviors influence sleep, but also conversely, I look how improving sleep can influence health outcomes in the daytime and beyond, both at long-term and shorter-term health outcomes. I will start with talking a bit about what is metabolic health. So what do I refer to when I say metabolic health throughout this presentation? From a clinical and research perspective, these are the indicators that we use to define what we mean somebody as being metabolically healthy. We look at a normal range body mass index. We look at normal blood pressure, and I put there some indicative values of what it would mean normal or within the healthy ranges. Normal blood fat indicators such as triglycerides and cholesterol, and normal blood sugar control. And this can be measured in a few ways, and I gave you there some examples. But notwithstanding the complexity of what metabolic health is, in general, we can define it as the maintenance of balance between energy intake and energy expenditure. Why do we talk about metabolic health? Why is it important? From a public health perspective, metabolic health is important as it is a significant risk for the leading causes of morbidity and mortality in the developed world. Metabolic health is a risk for obesity, type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease and stroke, which are the leading cause of disease and mortality currently. Therefore, it's an important topic. It's topical as we are concerned more and more with how we can address these issues, notwithstanding medication and other treatments available, but also in terms of addressing our lifestyle behavior. How could we improve that in order to promote better metabolic health and decrease the risk of either acquiring these illnesses or actually managing them once we have them. So I touched a bit upon that, how to maintain metabolic health, what lifestyle behaviors we could look at in order to maintain metabolic health. And the main ones would be diet, physical activity, and the avoidance of high-risk behaviors and high health risk behaviors such as smoking, alcohol, I also put there the management of mood, because the management of depression and anxiety is in itself a very important factor for managing metabolic health. And more recently, sleep quality and duration have started to be of interest to health researchers. As research in the area of metabolic health in general is growing, I think the recognition that sleep and health are intrinsically linked is starting to emerge. Sleep has a role in both maintaining metabolic health, but also conversely, metabolic health, that the status of your metabolic health can influence sleep by itself. So I am going to start with first explaining a bit about what sleep is. And I gave you there quite a basic definition of sleep as a basic function of the human body, which is characterized by immobility and reduced sensory responsiveness. And as such, typically, from a metabolic health perspective, it is our longest period of fasting, is the longest period in 24 hours where we do not eat or drink. It's a complete pause in that. It's our longest period of stasis, that is the longest period of immobility that we have throughout the day. I say typically because there may be people very rarely who may be perhaps in a period of stasis through the day if they are completely sedentary, or perhaps thinking of those people who are bedbound. That could be another portion of population. In itself, it has a major influence on appetite hormones and insulin control. So, considering all of this, where does sleep fit in metabolic health? In terms of research, the way I looked at it is first looking at the reciprocal relationship between daytime physical activity, which is a major promoter of metabolic health, and sleep quality. That's one strand of my research. But also looking at the important role of sleep in itself in the regulation of appetite hormones and insulin. Before proceeding with that, I'm going to talk a bit about sleep regulation and how it is controlled and regulated by various processes in our body. This will give you perhaps a better understanding of how you can then evaluate the evidence that I'm going to talk to you about in a bit. Our current understanding is that sleep is controlled by three processes. Homeostatic processes are really the physiological balance in our organism. So it's a tendency of the organism to compensate for external stimuli or for external events by maintaining the balance. That's a homeostatic process. A separate process are circadian processes, those concerned by means our biological clock. It's an independent rhythm that runs within roughly 24 hours. And psychological processes, and I'm going to talk a bit about this, and the most pertinent to sleep are processes of learning and cognitive arousal, or mental arousal, the mental alertness that is so important when it comes to sleep initiation. So I'm going to unpack that a bit. And the first one is the homeostatic process that I talked about. This is the sleep pressure that accumulates throughout a waking day. And the curve that you see there let's say with a 7 a.m. start of the day, as you wake up, through wakefulness, sleep pressure or sleep debt, if you'd like, accumulates through the day until it reaches a point where you fall asleep and then it's dissipated with sleep. So this homeostatic process, this internal process, depends on the sleep and wake behavior. It increases with sleep and it dissipates once you get sleep. And it works in this rhythm. The biological clock, on the other hand, runs independently of sleep and wake time. You could think of it as the unvarying hands of a clock that just runs across independent of the homeostatic process. The main indicators of the biological clock are, in terms of sleep, are temperature and the hormone melatonin, both of which aid the process of sleep. The nocturnal release of hormone melatonin aids in the in sleep onset, in falling asleep, and temperature through the night when it's falling aids in maintaining sleep through the night. So what the biological clock does in its modulation of activity and inactivity is that it creates opportunities or ideal times, if you'd like, within a 24-hour framework when sleep is optimal. So it gives those biological conditions optimal for sleep by releasing certain hormones and by lowering temperature. So taking into account somebody's biological clock or the ideal time for sleep is quite important. Hormones are also released in the same kind of rhythm, if you'd like, through the night and day. So that's how sleep may be very important in terms of its role in the management of this hormone control. Certain hormones are released more of the metabolic system. Now the sleep-wake cycle is entrained to roughly a 24-hour cycle, so it goes around in a 24-hour cycle, and the entrainment is synchronized to the daylight, to the biological daylight, through special cells on the retina which transmit light to the brain. Therefore, light exposure is also important in maintaining the biological clock entrained to the day and night that you are living in, the geographical location you are. Now, if we put these two together, so we talked about sleep pressure or sleep debt, which is the curve marked with S. Yeah, so that's the sleep debt that accumulates in the day with wakefulness. And then we have the biological clock, which is marked with a C on the figure. You see that these two processes work in harmony to create ideal times for sleeping, in the ideal times for rest and activity during a 24-hour period. So sleep works best when there is enough sleep pressure accumulated and the circadian clock is at a modulation where it allows optimal biological conditions for it to happen. Let's move on. Thus, sleep onset or falling asleep is most probable when we are appropriately sleepy, so when enough sleep pressure has accumulated through the day. We go to bed at an appropriate time, so our circadian clock gives us the ideal conditions for the body to be asleep. And these are the two psychological processes that I was talking about earlier. Ideally, the sleep environment is familiar and associated with restfulness. So this is where classical and operant principles of learning come into play. Pairing different stimuli together will make this process automatic. So, for example, when you see your bedroom environment, which is familiar and associated only with sleep, then it is more likely that that will happen. This process will come automatically. When this learning or when this pairing is separated, if, for example, the bedroom is used for eating or for watching movies or doing other activities that keep you mentally alert, it is very unlikely that that will promote sleep onset. And the other psychological factor, that we are appropriately calm or relaxed. So this is the cognitive de-arousal. I think we all must have experienced a night where you have something important happening the following day, or perhaps a flight to get in the morning, and you know how that affects your sleep, how things go through your mind again and again, and you just cannot quiet your mind to allow yourself to fall asleep. And this is another psychological process that needs to be appropriately controlled for an optimal sleep onset, is to just be appropriately de-aroused, so to a level where your mind is quiet enough to allow for sleep to happen. Right, let's go back to metabolic health and back to my slide on how to maintain metabolic health, and I mentioned physical activity as one important factor for maintaining metabolic health. My first interest was investigating that, looking on how daytime behavior, so the period of most activity that we have, can influence the quality of sleep, so the period of most inactivity that we have in the 24-hour framework. Now, regular physical activity has been shown to improve a range of cardiovascular outcomes, reduce severity symptoms, the severity of existing symptoms of existing illness, and also increase longevity in the long term. This is what current research studies are showing. Generally, a dose-response relationship exists between physical activity and good health, with more physical activity leading to better health outcomes in the long term. In terms of sleep, high levels of physical activity are also associated with improved sleep outcomes, improved sleep quality, for example. The current guidelines, the World Health Organization guidelines on physical activity for health, specify that people should accumulate at least 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity in a week in order to derive health benefits. Now, that's a minimum, and it's encouraged that this is how it should be looked at, as a minimum. What I ask myself is whether this level of physical activity, this recommended level of physical activity for health, could that impact sleep quality? Sleep quality was not part of the evidence when the guidelines were issued. And in order to answer that question, I examined a nationally representative sample of 1,042 people from Nottinghamshire area, who at the time of recruitment were 65 plus. There were three survey waves. It started in 1985 and then respondents were then again surveyed in 1989 and 1993. There were detailed assessments made of health, physical activity, and sleep at each survey wave. And then mortality was surveyed in this cohort to the date of when we did the analysis, which was 27 years later. So we had data on who died of what throughout these years. Okay, so what I did is I divided this cohort into two groups and just compared them. So I looked at those walking over 100, equal to or over 150 minutes a week, and those who were walking less than 150 minutes a week. Now we chose walking because it's quite a popular choice of physical activity, especially in the age group in our cohort. And that was the most widely reported physical activity that people engaged with in our cohort. So what did the results say? Well, the higher level of walking, so those people who are in the walking group, shall we call it, the high level of walking was significantly associated with increased longevity. So those in the group who walked over 150 minutes a week had a hazard ratio, that is a risk of reaching the terminal point, or the risk of dying, shall I say, was decreased by 23%. And also the higher level, and this is what the curves represent, is just the rate of failure through time, and the rate of death, shall I say, through time. Also the group who was walking 150 minutes or more a week also had lower levels of reported insomnia symptoms, often or all the time. They also reported a shorter duration of time in bed. Now this is important because time in bed is usually either a confounder of long sleep duration, and whether somebody spends their time in bed sleeping, or whether it's a proxy for inactivity. It's just time that people spend in bed, and that takes really out of the time that you would spend otherwise being active or doing stuff. So we did find that those people walking more spend less time in bed. Now this is the conclusion from our study, that in a representative sample of the UK population aged 65 plus, the internationally recommended levels of physical activity appear to provide a common threshold for both superior health and sleep outcomes amongst older people. And that is important because if, let's say, you are somebody who has trouble with managing sleep, perhaps knowing that you might derive these benefits from physical activity might be an additional motivator to actually engage in physical activity. So the next step after doing the analysis was to see whether, if we are to administer physical activity as a treatment to people who have sleeping difficulties, would that improve their sleep? Now, in our sample, the sample that I talked about earlier, all we can check for is associations between walking, quality of sleep, and dying. What we wanted to see is actually to design a study where we could experimentally test this hypothesis. So to do that, we designed a randomized controlled trial This trial took place here at Loughborough University with people from and around Loughborough. We recruited sedentary people at baseline. Sedentary people, we defined sedentary people as those people who engaged in 60 minutes or less of physical activity in a week. That's the definition we went for. There are many other definitions for sedentary behavior, but that's what we stuck to. We also recruited, so these people were sedentary, and in addition, they had chronic insomnia. Chronic insomnia is defined as the inability to fall asleep, stay asleep, or waking up too early in the morning, or reporting non-restorative sleep on a regular basis for at least 6 months. That's how insomnia is defined at the moment. Another condition of it is having adequate opportunity to sleep, but still being unable to do it. And the question we asked ourselves was, could physical activity which meets the minimum World Health Organization guidelines, so that would be the 150 minutes a week, could that reduce the severity of insomnia symptoms in our participants? These are the characteristics of the participants in the study. There were 41 adults. The mean age was 60 in our sample, and they were randomly allocated. So regardless of the preference of wanting to be in one group or another, they were randomly allocated to a physical activity group where they engaged in at least 150 minutes of walking in a week, or a waiting list control. So people in the control group kept their physical activity levels throughout the intervention period. It was a 6-month intervention in terms of its duration, and we monitored it. We monitored both sleep using wrist actigraphy, and we monitored the level of walking in order to make sure that it reached the threshold of intensity of what is moderate. So it's activity which is hard enough to make you breathe a bit harder, but not so hard that you cannot speak. So that would be the definition of moderate intensity activity. We monitored both the intensity and the duration of physical activity that people engaged in with pedometers and accelerometers. Right, so these were our results. What we saw was a significant reduction in insomnia severity symptoms. What's this slide? I'll just walk you through this slide. On the left-hand side, you will see the participants which are in two groups. These are all participants at baseline before any intervention started. The light bar chart is the control group, and the dark bar chart is the intervention group. And we gave them a questionnaire, the Insomnia Severity Index, which is basically, it asks about the severity of their insomnia, the impact, and so on. And then you get a score from that, and that score then can put you in a category on how severe your insomnia is. And we had some participants who had milder insomnia, in the subthreshold insomnia, and most of them were in the moderate severe insomnia range. After our intervention, so a 6-month on the right hand side, what we saw was a large reduction in severe cases. So a lot of the people in the black bar chart moved over to the subthreshold insomnia, to the milder form of insomnia. We also saw a significant reduction in depression and anxiety. We measured these two constructs at baseline and then after the intervention. Right, so this was our conclusion after the study, that increasing physical activity to the current recommended public health guidelines delivered clinically significant improvements in sleep quality amongst inactive people with insomnia. So what we saw here is that applying a lifestyle change in people who have chronic sleep problems could deliver clinically significant benefits. Right. So the studies so far show that what I showed you so far indicates that a major contributor to metabolic health, which is physical activity, can influence sleep quality. Now the next question we asked ourselves was, could sleep influence metabolic health? So could we see this relation in a reciprocal way? If we manipulated sleep, could we influence metabolic health? And sleep duration is a topical point at the moment. You must have seen it in the press, and perhaps all of us at some point or another have asked ourselves, am I sleeping enough hours? Now the current recommended guidelines for sleep duration say that adults should aim to sleep 7 to 9 hours a night. Now this is a guideline, and this may be quite different between people. Some people may have a preference for sleep time. There's also a difference in ages, with older people reporting, for example, shorter sleep durations overall. So this just serves as a guideline. This is what the majority of population seems to be anchored in. When we do large surveys, most people seem to sleep around this mark, around 7 hours. Now, around 25% of the population sleeps less than this recommended duration, so less than 7 hours a night. There are daytime consequences of shorter sleep. There's fatigue, excessive sleepiness, and impaired cognitive functioning during the day. Evidence also suggests that short sleep is significantly associated with both the incidence and the prevalence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. I want to point out that this is a relationship that we see, an association that could go both ways. So it could be that short sleep may lead to this, or it could be that the existence of bad health in the first place may lead to shorter sleep. That's why it's important to do experimental studies or find different ways and different avenues to address this question in order to untangle the direction of the relationship that we see. There are some current explanatory mechanisms as to why this relationship exists between short sleep and unfavorable health outcomes and mortality in the long term. It is hypothesized that short sleep may lead to a disruption in both appetite hormones and insulin or glucose regulation, but also that short sleep may lead to a change in eating and physical activity patterns. Now, if you recall earlier on, I was saying that two of the main lifestyle behaviors affecting metabolic health are diet and physical activity. And if short sleep affects that, then this is how it may influence metabolic health. This could be affected by, for example, eating more when we are sleep deprived for various reasons, not the least the fact that you have more time available in the day, which you might use by eating, and also being sleep deprived might lead to fatigue in the day, which in turn might make somebody less prone to actually engage in physical activity. So you could see a decline in overall physical activity levels. There is some evidence that that's what happens in people who are experimentally sleep deprived. Their physical activity levels in the day just dropped. So this could be another explanation as to how short sleep might affect metabolic health. In order to answer at least a part of this question, we designed a study, a sleep extension study. The research question that we asked ourselves was whether, first of all, was it feasible to extend sleep duration in overweight short sleepers who are at increased risk of type 2 diabetes? And I'm going to unpack a bit that particular group that we looked at. And the second research question was, if it works and we manage to extend sleep, could sleep extension positively impact glucose tolerance amongst overweight short sleepers who are at increased risk of type 2 diabetes? This was our study design. We recruited 22 men who were a mean age of 42 years old and with a mean body mass index of which puts them in a category of overweight. These people were at risk of diabetes, and the way we judged that was really looking through some health indicators which research has shown increase the risk significantly for developing diabetes at least at 5 years. So we look, for example, at waist circumference, of familial history of type 2 diabetes, hypertension, history of coronary heart disease in the family, and so on. There is a validated risk factor questionnaire which then scores people in terms of the whether they present a high, medium, or low risk for developing diabetes, and we use that to recruit people at risk. Our participants were randomized to an intervention or a control group. Again, this is a design that is most likely to result in an explanatory mechanism behind whether our intervention actually causes an effect. And the intervention duration was of 6 weeks. What was the intervention? How we extended sleep? Well, we invited participants to a session with a sleep expert. We went through a personalized sleep schedule. We had data from their sleep for 2 weeks prior to doing this, and basically we went through the sleep schedule and we looked at where could we append 90 minutes more a night of sleep, either at the beginning of the night or at the end of the night, in order to give people an opportunity to sleep. We already knew that these people were sleeping. The inclusion criteria for short sleepers in our study is sleeping 6 hours or less a night. So we knew that there was room there for more sleep. This was supported by cognitive and behavioral strategies. So these are things that I talked about earlier, looking at the bedroom environment, making sure that it was conducive of sleep, and also equipping participants with some cognitive strategies that allowed them to relax their mind or de-arouse in order to have the optimal conditions for falling asleep, if you'd like. In terms of outcome measures, we looked at sleep actigraphy, so we measured sleep with this wrist-worn device. This wrist-worn device also measures light exposure. We also, the procedure to measure appetite hormone response to a meal challenge. That is actually inviting participants in the lab, giving them a meal, and then measuring, taking blood samples for the next 3 hours to see how the hormones respond to a meal. We also had a glucose sensor. This is a small sensor which is placed on the upper arm. It takes measures of glucose every 15 minutes for 2 weeks. What that gave us was a longer-term measure of glucose control, including looking at how glucose oscillated through the night. Right, this is an example data that we get from the wrist actigraph that participants wear. The blue portion of it is the sleep period. The black is the activity during the day. Well, as you can see, there's a bit of activity in the night too. And well, this was in the wrong order. And the yellow is the light intensity. As I said, it had a light sensor on it, so it allows us to also look at how much light exposure somebody receives through the day. Light is quite important, as I said, in order for the entrainment of the circadian clock to the day and night rhythm. This is an example of data that we get from the glucose sensor. All those dots that you can barely see, all those are measures of glucose taken every 15 minutes. And by putting it together, we can have a measure of glucose over 24 hours or over the 2 weeks that the participant wore the device for. Right, some preliminary findings, and I'm gonna put that caveat in because some of the analysis is still ongoing of the data that we have. Were that, first of all, the sleep extension intervention was successful, and this was one of the main purposes of the study, was to see of whether it works. Does telling somebody to sleep more with a bit of support, does it result in actually them sleeping more? And it did work. On average, sleep was extended by 93 minutes per night in the intervention group. That is quite good, because what it means is it brings participants who say on average sleep 6 hours a night into the range of recommended sleep duration per night. There were significant changes in fasting insulin levels, with the intervention group showing significant improvements in insulin control measures that we had. That is another very important finding, because our intervention was only 6 weeks. Now 6 weeks is a short duration of time, and the intervention that we did also did not involve anything special. It's just asking people to sleep a bit more. To have such a significant result from such a short duration intervention and such a non-invasive intervention is quite a good result. However, we found no changes in appetite hormone levels. There is still one hormone that we are still to have the analysis on, but in terms of the ones that we have tested so far, we have found no changes in it. Now, these were the existing conclusions from the sleep extension study, is that it is a feasible lifestyle intervention, so it can be done. It results in improved blood sugar control, improved sleep quality, and reduced daytime fatigue. So these are some psychological outcomes that we measured at the beginning and at the end of the study. Now, obviously our results have to take into account the limitations of our study. It is a small study that is done in a very specific population of overweight men who are of a certain status in terms of their health. But these results are really encouraging, and I think it warrants further investigations, because such a change in the lifestyle in terms of just improving sleep. I know when I say just improving sleep, it's not that easy. But if you compare that with other lifestyle interventions, which perhaps require more time or more effort, the results that we got from it are quite significant. But obviously, further questions we now have in terms of further directions, where do we go from here? Is the finding robust? So could we actually replicate these findings in a bigger study, in perhaps different measures of the same constructs? So looking at other health indicators. Who benefits most? This is an interesting point. We looked at people at risk of diabetes. Could people who already have diabetes benefit from it? Could other clinical groups benefit from it? Obviously, there are other demographics that we need to address, like women or perhaps different ages and so on, each of whom brings different challenges in terms of a trial design. Are there any long-term benefits? There is some evidence that in terms of the response that we see, for example, the insulin results that we got, there is some evidence that after a while of an intervention, the body kind of adjusts to the new rhythm that is got, and we don't know whether long term this results would hold if we, for example, apply a 3-month or a 6-month intervention period where we get the same results. Whether they would be better, I mean, that's another possibility, is that we would get even better results if we extend it beyond 6 weeks. But obviously these are questions that need to be addressed appropriately. And not the least, what are the mechanisms? As I said, we can directly look at the disruption of hormones. We have also measured physical activity and diet in our samples, so we will be looking at that and to test this hypothesis that perhaps short sleep affects diet intake, and physical activity levels in the day. But these are questions that our data will address at a later date, hopefully within the next few weeks. So this is a summary. It's quite brief. That metabolic health has an important role to play in sleep management, and I illustrated that with those studies looking at physical activity and its effects on sleep, but also that sleep could potentially have an important role in the management of metabolic health. So sleep in itself could result in improved, addressing sleep could result in improved sleep health by itself. Right, and I thank you. I hope I didn't rush through it. I didn't talk too fast, but I can take any questions